The October 1st, 2017 Las Vegas Massacre was the worst mass shooting in modern American history, and the largest homicide investigation in the history of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. As a result of gunman Stephen Paddock's carnage, the massacre ultimately resulted in the death of 60 Route 91 Harvest Music Festival attendees and the wounding by gunfire of hundreds of others. In 2021, 4 years after the Las Vegas Massacre, Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo, who runs the Las Vegas Metro Police Department and who is currently a candidate for Nevada governor, changed the official narrative on the death of Stephen Paddock. It was well established that Paddock shot himself almost immediately after he fired his last shots at 10:16 p.m. on October 1st, 2017. No Las Vegas Metro police officers ever approached Paddock's room prior to lone SWAT officer Levi Hancock and his ad hoc team of patrol officers breach Paddock's Mandalay Bay Hotel Suite, room 32135, at 11:20 p.m., over 1 hour after Paddock fired his last shots. That was proven on police body camera footage that was subsequently released by court order after Lombardo's failed attempt to prevent the release of any documentation and video that was in the possession of his department. On November 8, 2021, an article appeared in the Carson City, Nevada newspaper, the Nevada Appeal, that was authored by reporter Ray Hagar of Nevada Newsmakers, that quoted Lombardo as saying during an interview on Friday, November 5, 2021, that the shooter killed himself in his hotel room with the officers outside the door, with the officers trying to get in. Lombardo said, "I firmly believe that him knowing we were at the door is the reason why he took his own life," Lombardo said. Ladies and gentlemen, Lombardo's statement is not true. Once again, Lombardo has perpetrated a lie to the press and to the public, apparently for his own personal and political agenda. Unless Sheriff Joe Lombardo, the highest law enforcement official in Clark County, Nevada, is withholding evidence from the public, Lombardo's statements are lies. If the Las Vegas Metro Police have concealed evidence from the public that proves Stephen Paddock shot himself as the entry team was at his door, then I, for one, want to see it. Folks, listen to what I'm saying here. SWAT officer Levi Hancock, who in my opinion did a great job that night with his ad hoc team, transmitted over the radio that they were going to breach the door to Paddock's suite to see if anything was still inside the room, if anyone was still inside the room, or if they went somewhere else. That is not only documented on the Police Communications Center audio recording, but also on police body camera footage by the patrol officers who were with Hancock. Why would Hancock make a statement that they did not know if anybody was still in the room if indeed they heard a shot when they were at the door? If you hear a shot from inside the room, then you would know somebody was indeed still inside the room, and that, folks, was not the case. Paddock is dead. We will never know why he stopped firing that night and then killed himself, as we were told. No action by the Las Vegas Metro Police ever ceased Paddock's firing as he was slaughtering people unimpeded for over 10 minutes. Paddock didn't take his own life because police officers were at his door, as Lombardo reportedly said. Then, according to the article, Lombardo described the murder of 60 people as a, quote, one-off event. I'm sure that comment is very comforting to the survivors and the family members of those who were murdered at the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival. The article goes on with Lombardo's comments that he was proud of his department's response because the timeliness prevented further carnage and that Paddock could have continued his carnage for quite some time. Lombardo apparently had a memory lapse because the carnage did continue for some time as Las Vegas Metro Police Field Training Officer Cordell Hendricks failed to take any action or even attempted to take any action to cease the threat, as people were being slaughtered as he retreated on the 31st floor of the Mandalay Bay Hotel. In addition to that, Lombardo, who said on 8 News Now Las Vegas, 1 month after the massacre, that the police made entry into Paddock's room because they didn't want to give Paddock the opportunity to reload and or continue firing. The problem with that lie, as I previously said, is that nobody entered Paddock's room until well over 1 hour. So now with Lombardo's revelation that Paddock didn't shoot himself until the entry team was at his door trying to get in at 11:20 p.m., over 1 hour after the last shots were fired, then that further corroborates Lombardo's lie that they wanted to go in to stop him from reloading. So if they believed he was alive for well over an hour, why wasn't entry made sooner? Lombardo is a liar, just like his then Undersheriff Kevin McMahill, who is currently a candidate for Clark County Sheriff, and who lied on Fox News about when Paddock's gunfire stopped, as I reported in episode 80. Lombardo and McMahill are 2 peas in the same corrupt, incompetent pod. Folks, the Las Vegas Metro Police didn't even have a mass casualty plan in place prior to the Las Vegas Massacre. No SWAT officers / counter snipers were deployed during the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival, even though, as I exclusively reported, an LVMPD and FBI training scenario years before the massacre made it clear that a sniper attack from a hotel high-rise tower posed a threat.
As our officers get up onto the stairwell, there's an L-shaped metal bracket that was used by the suspect to keep the officers from being able to open the fire escape door, which is where they would have entered in. So as they get that door breached, the shooting stops.
That I authored approximately 165 articles for the Baltimore Post-Examiner on the October 1st, 2017 Las Vegas Massacre, more than any other single journalist in the country. I broke one story after another, many which were never covered by the Las Vegas media, and often appeared on radio and television news shows discussing my work. The news clip you just watched from 2019 was then Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Undersheriff Kevin McMahill, who at the time was the second-ranking officer under Clark County, Nevada Sheriff Joe Lombardo, who runs the Las Vegas Metro Police Department. The Fox News Network's Fox Nation aired that interview with McMahill as part of their story on the October 1st, 2017 Las Vegas Massacre that aired on October 1st, 2019, 2 years after the massacre, which was the worst mass shooting in modern American history and the largest homicide investigation in the history of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. 2 years after the Las Vegas Massacre, Undersheriff Kevin McMahill still could not get his facts straight and tell the truth to the public. McMahill duped the public and Fox News as well by portraying a false narrative during that interview. In simpler terms, McMahill lied. That's exactly what it was, folks, a total all-out lie. McMahill's comment was bad enough at the time, but even worse now, since McMahill, who retired in December of 2020, is currently a candidate for Sheriff of Clark County, Nevada. McMahill's former boss, Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo, is currently a candidate for Governor of Nevada. Both Lombardo and McMahill have serious credibility issues, to say the least, have lied to the press many times, and both are complicit in multiple police department cover-ups, several which I have exposed when I was writing as an investigative journalist for the Baltimore Post-Examiner, and more recently, starting in May 2020, on my new forum for my independent investigative journalism work, the podcast you are watching now, Truth and Consequences with Doug Poppa. Let's revisit what Kevin McMahill said, quoting from McMahill's interview on Fox. There's an L-shaped metal bracket that was used by the suspect to keep the officers from opening the fire escape door, which is where they would have went in. So luckily, one of our SWAT officers, Levi Hancock, had self-deployed. He had a tool that allowed him to defeat the L-shaped bracket, and so, as they get that door breached, the shooting stops. Let me say that again. And so, as they get that door breached, the shooting stops. Like I said, that statement by McMahill was not true. McMahill, the number 2 man in command of the Las Vegas Metro Police at the time, did not know when the shooting stopped, 2 years after the massacre. He most certainly did. It was all about public image for the police department. Here's the truth, folks. Stephen Paddock stopped firing sometime between 10:15 p.m. and 10:16 p.m. on October 1st, 2017, way before Levi Hancock had even entered the stairwell. Hancock and his ad hoc team of patrol officers arrived into the 32nd floor stairwell just a few minutes shy of 11 o'clock p.m. on October 1st, 2017. They breached the stairwell door a few minutes later. There was no gunfire going on, folks. And then they did the explosive breach on Paddock's suite at 11:20 p.m., over 1 hour after the last shots were fired. It was extremely disturbing that Fox News didn't verify what McMahill had said. McMahill presented a false narrative to the public, once again, as to the events that happened that night. If you recall, I reported back in October 2017 that McMahill had told the press at that time that they couldn't make entry into Paddock's suite until the full SWAT team arrived. As I pointed out then, the full SWAT team never arrived. Then McMahill said on Fox News, quote, "And what we try to do in those situations, if there's people actively being killed, it doesn't matter. We train to go through the door." Well, if that was the case, if you remember, then why did Las Vegas Metro Police Field Training Officer Cordell Hendricks and Officer Ella Vossen, along with 3 armed Mandalay Bay assistant security managers, all retreat on the 31st floor for well over 4 minutes, while people were being killed and made no attempt at all to reach the shooter just 1 floor above? In a story that I wrote for the Baltimore Post-Examiner, I pointed out that Lombardo said armed security are a force multiplier for the police. So, 5 armed personnel did nothing as lives were being lost and casualties were piling up that night. In addition to that armed contingent, on the 32nd floor, while Paddock was firing, there was also the Mandalay Bay armed security operations manager, along with 2 armed security bike patrol officers, who also made no attempt to save lives. A total of 8 armed personnel in the vicinity of Paddock's suite, and nobody even attempted to do anything. What did Fox News have to say about Hendricks and all those armed officers? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Never mentioned it in the 1 hour and 30-minute documentary. Hendricks's name and his failure to act never came up. Then McMahill, commenting on why it took so long to enter Paddock's Mandalay Bay Hotel suite, said, quote, "They're very reluctant to go in when there's nobody being killed at that particular point." Really? Because that is the opposite of what Sheriff Lombardo said 1 month after the massacre during his November 2nd, 2017 interview with George Knapp of KLAS-TV's 8 News Now I-Team. Lombardo told Knapp, quote, "In this case, because of what the suspect did, officers made the decision to breach this doorway of the hotel room in case the guy was reloading. Maybe he was reloading magazines. We didn't want to give him the opportunity to keep firing." The problem with that statement, folks, was nobody made entry into the suite until well over 1 hour. So where was the concern for the public safety, as Lombardo stated? Lombardo was never challenged by Knapp on that. Knapp went on to another question. During the McMahill interview on Fox, he then said, quote, "I don't think anybody would believe that when we went into that room, that we would find a 64-year-old white man be responsible for this. Why not, McMahill? White men have committed more mass murder throughout American history more than any other race. ATF Special Agent Jill Snyder also appeared in the documentary. Snyder said, quote, "I will never forget that day. I walked into the room. There was a blood stain on the floor where he shot himself. Thousands of empty shell casings." Let me repeat that again. Thousands of empty shell casings. Really? Thousands of empty shell casings? Well, because according to the Las Vegas Metro Police's final criminal investigative report, they recovered approximately 1,050 .223 expended cartridge casings from room 32-135, not thousands. Mandalay Bay security officer Jesus Campos was only mentioned briefly in the Fox documentary as being shot in the leg. No mention was made as to why Campos, after observing the L bracket drilled into the fire stairwell door and jamb, then heard drilling noises inside Paddock's suite, just walked away without ever investigating or calling that in. That will go down as the worst case of security negligence in the history of the hotel casino industry. On October 8, 2017, the Baltimore Post-Examiner broke the story that was titled, "Las Vegas Police Borrowed Armored Vehicles from Private Company." In that story, I wrote that the LVMPD borrowed armored vehicles from Battlefield Vegas, a company that provides customers with the opportunity to fire fully automatic weapons and owns a fleet of surplus military vehicles. At the time, the LVMPD and Battlefield Vegas refused to comment when I asked. A representative of Battlefield Vegas appeared in the documentary 2 years later, 2019, and stated, quote, "A friend from LVMPD called, stating they needed to use our armored personnel carriers. They then provided them to the police." One of the male survivors who appeared in the documentary said, quote, "I believe it was a sniper's paradise because you had several tall buildings all facing down at a central low area with no cover." The Baltimore Post-Examiner broke the story that MGM Resorts International, who owns the Mandalay Bay Hotel, along with the FBI and the LVMPD, were all fully aware of the threat posed by a sniper attack from an elevated position in a hotel high-rise tower years before the massacre. I updated my original Baltimore Post-Examiner story on August 9, 2021, in episode 59 of this podcast, titled Las Vegas Massacre, FBI, LVMPD, MGMRI knew sniper attack posed a threat prior to 2017. Apparently, nothing was learned from that training scenario, as it was ignored in the pre-planning stages for the Route 91 Music Festival, as was the 2014 incident when a convicted felon brought an arsenal of weapons into a room in one of the high-rise towers at the Mandalay Bay Hotel and had a high-powered rifle pointed to a window overlooking the Las Vegas Strip, according to court records that I obtained. To date, the FBI has not released any of their forensic analysis reports on any of the evidence, including the results of the examination of the bullets that were recovered from victims, survivors, and the concert area. Were they all matched as having been fired from the firearms seized in the rooms? Who knows? Fox News did a good job on the documentary as far as the human interest story goes. That being said, I was disappointed because their investigative approach fell short. The October 1st, 2017 Las Vegas Massacre should never have happened. I said that numerous times over and over again when I was writing my stories for the Baltimore Post-Examiner, and backed up what I said. It was the result, ladies and gentlemen, of complacency, ignorance, and incompetence on behalf of MGM Resorts International and the police. Failed police leadership and political correctness resulted in a lack of preparedness on the night of October 1st, 2017. With all the millions of dollars that run through Las Vegas in one day, it was a tragedy in itself that it took the death of 58 people that night and the wounding of hundreds of others to implement measures that should have been in place prior to the Las Vegas Massacre. That's a very nice resume for Sheriff Lombardo, who wants to be governor of Nevada, and Kevin McMahill, who wants to be the top law enforcement official in Clark County, Nevada. Both of these guys, ladies and gentlemen, are documented liars. Their credibility is in the sewer. When I wrote that story back in 2019, I stated that I had received inquiries from survivors and family members of the victims of the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival, questioning why former Nevada District Court Judge Jennifer Tagliati, who retired earlier in 2019, was one of the mediators who was involved with the civil lawsuit mediation between attorneys for MGM Resorts International and attorneys for the victims of the Route 91 Harvest Music Festival. What was the concern, you may ask? Well, Jennifer Tagliati, as I reported, is the daughter of George Tagliati, who was a retired FBI special agent, and listen to this, and was the vice president of security, surveillance, and safety at the Mandalay Bay Hotel during the night of the Las Vegas Massacre. And yes, his daughter was involved in the mediation. That just didn't sit right with a lot of people.
Now, in normal practice, if we were going to execute a search warrant, say on a barricaded individual, we could take all the time we need and bring all the resources to bear to ensure everybody's safety. In this case, because of what the suspect did, the officers made the decision to breach this doorway of the hotel room in case this guy was reloading. Maybe he was reloading magazines. We didn't want to give him the opportunity to keep firing. And then when they made entry, they found out he had committed suicide. In case this guy was reloading. Maybe he was reloading magazines. We didn't want to give him the opportunity to keep firing. In case this guy was reloading. Maybe he was reloading magazines. We didn't want to give him the opportunity to keep firing. In case this guy was reloading. Maybe he was reloading magazines. We didn't want to give him the opportunity to keep firing. In case this guy was reloading. Maybe he was reloading magazines. We didn't want to give him the opportunity to keep firing. Actually, when the police officers get there, they don't hear it, the shooting, because the suspect had stopped firing. But during that time, the suspect had stopped firing. And so when we don't hear any firing taking place, then it becomes slow and methodical. If he had continued to shoot, we would have made entry on that door and engaged the suspect. If he had continued to shoot, we would have made entry on that door and engaged the suspect. If he had continued to shoot, we would have made entry on that door and engaged the suspect.
Welcome to episode 63 for Saturday, October 2nd, 2021. Yesterday marked 4 years since the October 1st, 2017 Las Vegas Massacre, the worst mass shooting in modern American history. On that tragic night, 58 Route 91 Harvest Music Festival attendees never went back home alive. Hundreds of others will hold the emotional and physical scars with them for the rest of their lives. It's one thing to know yourself that you are incompetent and a liar, and it's another thing to go on television and portray that to the public. As you just saw, that is exactly what Clark County Sheriff Joe Lombardo, who commands the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, did 1 month after the Las Vegas Massacre. Once again, Lombardo perpetrated a false narrative to the public to protect his own image and that of the department. The truth be damned. Many politicians, and that is exactly what an elected sheriff is, believe that they can get away with blowing smoke up the public's ass and spew out lies, deceptive statements, and comments, some which defy logic. What is worse is when they go unchallenged by members of the media. Sheriff Lombardo would never want to be interviewed by an experienced investigative journalist, someone he has no control over, who would have the knowledge and the common sense to at least challenge him on his lies and deceptive comments. As the head of the Las Vegas Metro Police, Lombardo can remain silent when he deems it necessary, controls his public information office, who in turn decide which information will be released to the media, what information will be covered up, and which journalists' media requests for comment will be answered. So much for transparency and accountability in the Las Vegas Metro Police under Lombardo's reign. It has been a pattern and practice that goes back decades with former sheriffs. On November 2, 2017, 1 month after the massacre, Lombardo sat down for an interview with Las Vegas reporter George Knapp of KLAS-TV 8 News Now, the excerpts that you just saw at the opening of this episode. Had I been interviewing Lombardo, after he made the statement, quote, "In this case, because of what the suspect did, officers made the decision to breach this doorway of the hotel room in case the guy was reloading. Maybe he was reloading magazines. We didn't want to give him the opportunity to keep firing," unquote. I would have challenged Lombardo because that statement was false. My response to Lombardo would have been, "Sheriff Lombardo, that statement you just made is not true. If you didn't want to give Paddock the opportunity to keep firing and or reload magazines, then why did you wait over 1 hour after the last shots were fired before your officers made entry into Paddock's suite? Sheriff, it doesn't take an hour to reload and open fire again. If that was your concern for the public safety, even after the gunfire stopped, then can you explain to the public now why you waited 1 hour?" That is what I would have challenged Lombardo on had I been conducting that interview. But I didn't conduct that interview, and Lombardo was never challenged by George Knapp on that. Further in the interview, Lombardo said, almost contradicting his previous statement, had Paddock started firing again, the police officers would have gone into the room immediately. That was another comment that defied logic, yet Lombardo went unchallenged by Knapp. Let's analyze this for a minute. Under Lombardo's rationale, he would have waited until Paddock started killing and wounding more victims. Then the police would have gone in had that happened. This came out of the mouth of the highest law enforcement officer in Clark County, Nevada. My response to Lombardo, like I said, had I been conducting that interview, would have been, "Sheriff Lombardo, how many more people would have been killed and or wounded had Paddock opened fire again and prior to and during your officers attempting to make entry?" It was an utterly incompetent statement by Sheriff Lombardo. Keep in mind, in that 1 hour period before SWAT officer Levi Hancock breached Paddock's 32nd floor Mandalay Bay hotel suite with his ad hoc team of K-9 and patrol officers, they weren't even sure anybody was still in the room. Hancock broadcasted on the radio before initiating his explosive breach on the door. "We need to pop this and see if we get any type of response from this guy, to see if he's in here or if he's actually moved somewhere else."
Paul, if you're aware of that, we'll get back. The department's due to get